Hi all. So welcome to the video lecture for Module 4. In this module, we're going to be looking at this period after the United States is established as a nation, up through kind of the 1830s. And we'll be going over some very basic stuff about how the US is established, how it sets up some of its basic political and economic structures. We'll talk about the first significant war the United States fights and the outcome of that. And then we'll kind of hint towards our next module on reform and so on by finishing by looking at the changes wrought by one of the more powerful presidents in the United States, a guy named Andrew Jackson. So I've called this module Empire of Liberty, and I've got it here with a question mark, because Empire of Liberty is a phrase Thomas Jefferson used to describe the early expansion of the United States towards the Mississippi and into what would become the Louisiana Purchase, the area west of the Mississippi River that we'll see in a minute. And he thought it would create liberty, freedom for poorer and middling white people. But instead, much of this region turns into the center of the opposite of liberty, slavery. So we're going to kind of see the early inklings of that process, but for this module, our focus is going to be less on that aspect of slavery and more on kind of the political and other economic structures. So we'll begin by looking at the first president of the United States, right? Someone we saw a little bit in Module 3, and that's George Washington. And Washington is elected easily as the first president of the United States. He's seen as a leader and a unifying figure to many, although of course to many he's the opposite of that, as someone who owns a large plantation and holds hundreds of people in slavery. But for many, Washington's a uniting figure for many white leaders. He represents a refusal to engage in partisan politics, or at least they think he does. And he represents someone that they see as what they want their new nation to be. Washington leaves office after serving 8 years, 2 terms of 4 years. And one thing to remember is that many of the things we think of today as standard parts of the US don't come out of the Constitution, at least not initially, but they come from precedent. That is, the first time they're done kind of sets the example going forward. So when Washington completes his 2nd term, there's no law or rule that says he can't run for a 3rd term, which he would have won. But he chooses only to run for 2 because he says the president should only serve 2 terms. But it will take nearly 200 years after Washington leaves for that actually to become law, right? Until the mid-20th century, mid-1900s. While Washington is in office, one of the most prominent voices is a guy pictured here, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's a close political ally of Washington. He worked with him during the war, the Revolution. And after, he's a prominent voice, mostly as Secretary of the Treasury, so he's heavily involved in the economy. And one of Hamilton's big things is the United States has borrowed money, much like Great Britain did, to fight a war. Some states individually had paid off some of their debt, and most people assumed the United States would do the same. The US would pay off its debt and exist without a debt. But Hamilton advocates for something very different. He says, quote, "A national debt, if not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be a powerful cement to our union." And what he means is that there are advantages he sees for a national debt. And I think a useful way to think about this is to think about your own lives, right? There are reasons why some people willingly choose to take on debt when they don't need to. And I don't mean because they want to buy things they don't have the cash for, although that's one reason. But think about it this way, right? You may have heard sometimes that, oh, well, you need to build your credit so that if you ever want to have a mortgage or a car loan or something like that, you have a good credit score and you'll get a better rate and you'll be able to get the loan. And Hamilton thinks of something similar. He says the United States is a new nation. It needs to essentially build its credit. So it should take the money it has, or the debt it has, rather, and it should keep it small, modest is his term, and they should pay it off or make payments on it regularly so that people, nations, large banks in Europe and elsewhere, who might in the future lend them money, see them as a reliable borrower. And the second reason he has, in addition to building credit, is he says it'll be a powerful cement to our union. Cement meaning adhesive, like glue. And what he means is, he says we should take on all the debt of the individual states and make it federal, national, US debt. And he says because of that, all these states who right now see themselves as just a loose coalition will start to look to the federal government as the primary authority. This is controversial on both counts. Many people don't want a debt. But Hamilton manages to get it through. And Congress does approve his policies, and that's kind of the origin of the United States national debt. And as Washington's time in office concludes, he gives a farewell address, a speech as he leaves office at the end of his 8 years. And it's printed in all the newspapers, it's sold as a book. You can see an image here from 1811, right? Decades after, or over a decade after, I should say. And in Washington's speech, he essentially has two main points. Advice for the nation going forward. He says, one, the nation should avoid foreign entanglements, basically getting involved in wars in other parts of the world. He's especially thinking of Europe here. He says this will cause trouble, cause the US to get more debt, put itself at risk. The second thing he says is the United States should avoid partisan politics. There shouldn't be any political parties. People should run as individuals and be elected on their individual merits. As soon as Washington's out of office, both of these start to fall by the wayside. Apologies for the pixelation here. These two men, Thomas Jefferson here to the left of your screen, and John Adams here to the right of your screen, were heavily involved during Washington's government. Jefferson was Secretary of State, which means in charge of foreign affairs, basically. And Adams had been vice president. So they're two leading people. And they publicly defer to Washington in general and see him as a wise person when they're in public. But quite quickly, they're establishing their own alliances, political groupings. They don't like to call them parties initially because Washington doesn't say it. But even as Washington's leaving office, his two things are being ignored. There will quickly be political parties, and not too long after, there will be conflict with a European power. Adams and Jefferson run against each other, and Adams is successful in winning the election. He serves only a single 4-year term, as you may be able to see by the dates he's in power. And during this 4-year term, I'm not going to get into the details, you can find it in your textbook reading, the United States, under his watch, gets into a conflict, which is usually called a quasi-war, an undeclared war, with France. Neither side invades the other, but they fight in the Caribbean with navies and so on. There's much fear it will lead to an actual full-out war, to the point that Adams and his Congress, his supporters in Congress, forced through what turn out to be unconstitutional limits on the free press and on immigrants. And both are repealed by the time Adams leaves office. But Adams, as a result of his conduct in this undeclared war, which again you can find out more about in the textbook reading, comes into some conflict with Thomas Jefferson, his political rival, and becomes much less popular. So Adams, as your textbook outlines, has a political party and group of supporters known as Federalists. Jefferson's political supporters go by a number of names. We can see them as Democrat Republicans, a few different names. For our purposes in this video lecture, we're going to call them Republicans just to be consistent. But keep in mind that these Republicans have no relation to the Republican Party of today, which is founded in the 1850s, some decades later. So Jefferson sweeps Adams out of office. You can see here he receives 53% of the electoral vote and a larger portion of the popular vote, I believe. And when Jefferson gets into power, he seeks to radically transform what government looks like. All governments in Europe and North America were quite small by modern standards at this time. There was very low taxes. Governments didn't do a whole lot. But Jefferson wants to take this to an extreme. He starts out by reducing the Army and the Navy by between 30 and 50%, reducing their size. He dramatically reduces already low government taxes and spending. He really would like the only income for the US government to come from customs duties and selling land. He gets rid of pretty much any other kind of tax, which has the effect, if you remember back to Module 3, we talked about the 3/5 clause and how it increased political representation for white people in areas that had large enslaved populations, while also increasing taxes. Jefferson eliminates all those taxes. So now, by this point, the only effect of the 3/5 clause is to inflate the votes of white people in predominantly enslaved areas. And this works to Jefferson's advantage, as he would not have been elected in one of his two elections were it not for the 3/5 clause. Basically, Jefferson wants as small a government as possible, and his ideas are going to be influential for decades to come on future presidents. Another major thing that happens under Jefferson's watch that I'm going to largely leave to your textbook, but I just wanted to kind of signpost here, is the Louisiana Purchase, which is of sort of dubious constitutional legality, but happens regardless. And you can see it's this region, and it nearly doubles the territory of the United States that the United States claims at the time. And almost none of this area was effectively under control of the United States, excluding some small areas of what is today Louisiana. The rest of it was largely controlled by indigenous powers. So we move through these early years that I've kind of gone through really quickly, and I think you can rely on your textbook for, of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and setting up some basic political institutions. But I want to spend a few minutes on what unfolds in the US in 1812, 1813, and 1814 under Jefferson's successor, a man named James Madison. James Madison is an acolyte or apprentice in some ways to Thomas Jefferson. He lives near Jefferson. He's worked with him. Both of them have worked in law. Both of them own large plantations in the same area of Virginia. Madison's a little bit different than Jefferson, however, in that Jefferson was seen as a commanding, charismatic figure, and Adams is very much not that. He was seen as a real intellectual. He was responsible for much of the drafting of the Constitution, but he was seen as totally lacking in charisma and authority. One contemporary said he was, quote, so low in stature, meaning short, he was in danger of being confounded or confused with the plebeian crowds and was pushed and jostled about like a common citizen. And this was in stark contrast to George Washington, who was kind of a commanding 6'4" figure, and this was seen as key for leadership for men at this time. Really, his only social gifts were that he was quite good at charming small groups of politicians by telling smutty or dirty jokes, basically, but was generally thought of, in the words of one of his contemporaries, as, quote, the most unsociable creature in existence. But this was balanced a little bit by his wife, Dolly Madison, who was much larger than Madison, both in stature and in her presence and charisma. She was a well-known First Lady who became known derisively to some as the, quote, Presidentess, to some who thought she wielded too much power. She instituted certain things. Today, often when the president enters a room, Hail to the Chief is played with sort of some pomp and circumstance. This starts during Madison's time in office. Dolly Madison did this because she thought it would give more sort of, well, literal fanfare to Madison, and make him seem more like a president. But Adams will be president during the first real war, big war, that the United States fights in its existence. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on for the next couple minutes. So the question is, why in 1812 would the United States want to go to war? It's a nation that's barely more than 20 years old. It's just come out of a brutal, bloody war for independence against Great Britain. And guess what? The United States is going to declare war. It's not going to have war declared on it. And they're going to declare war in what will become known as the War of 1812, creatively, on Great Britain again. Great Britain, still generally regarded as the one of, if not the most powerful militaries in the world. The United States will declare war on Great Britain. So why would they do this? Well, Madison has to go in front of Congress when he wants to declare war and give reasons. And the reasons he gives are kind of weird. He says it's about impressment. And what impressment basically means, it's a practice whereby navies would round up unwilling people and force them to serve as sailors in the Navy. Great Britain was particularly notorious, their Royal Navy, for doing this, because for many people, being a sailor was a pretty awful life. Great Britain had been stopping American ships and sometimes forcing American sailors to serve as part of the Royal Navy. Madison said this was a huge violation of the US's right to be neutral, to not participate in European wars, and that Great Britain wouldn't dare do this with any country they respected as a nation, and that the United States had to fight a war to maintain its integrity and prove that it had to be treated like a nation, just like the European powers that Great Britain would engage with. But this doesn't actually make any sense, because this is a map that shows which members of Congress, basically which regions, voted to go to war and which ones didn't. Yellow means they voted against the war. Blue means they voted in favor. So you would expect, if a war is being fought in defense of sailors and shipping, that the areas that would most support the war would be big port cities that rely on shipping, that have large populations of sailors. But if we look, areas like New York City, areas like Philadelphia, Baltimore, they're actually voting against the war. And most of the support for the war comes from areas on the western and northern borders of the United States and areas away from the ocean. It's not universally true. There is some support here, certainly, although this is mostly areas without major ports, except for Charleston. So what's going on? And if we look at sort of diaries and letters and documents from the time, we start to see that there might be a second big reason for the war. And that is, there's real anger in the United States among a lot of kind of powerful people that Great Britain who control the area that is today Canada still, are actively providing encouragement and supplies to indigenous powers in areas the United States claims to resist the United States. And that in fact, it's many of the people living on what Americans would have called at the time the frontier that are pushing for the war because they want to stop Great Britain from supporting Native American nations who might be resisting American invasions of their land. So that's a big reason why the US goes to war. At the same time, they go to war over partisan politics. So here we have a political cartoon of George Washington, apparently in heaven, gazing down disapprovingly at the squabbling politicians who are threatening to pull down liberty, which you can't really see here, but it says liberty and independence. And the two parties I mentioned, the Federalists of John Adams and the Republicans of Jefferson, have very different ideas about this. The Federalists are generally get along well with the British, and the Republicans prefer the French. And these two powers are always fighting each other in Europe. And the Republicans who are in power in the US under Madison, who's himself a Republican, really don't like Britain and are more disposed to go to war with Britain. And in fact, when the war begins, some Federalists go so far as to almost support Britain over the United States. The US is always trying to get loans to help fight the war. And many of the banks in the US are controlled by Federalists, and many of them refuse to loan money to the United States. It's seen as a party war, a political war, a Republican war. And because of that, and the Republicans being in control, there's a real tension. I've just told you that Jefferson, the founding Republican, reduced dramatically not too long ago the size of the Army and Navy. I also told you that not too long ago, Jefferson slashed almost all taxes and income for the US, leaving the US as a country with very little money and a very small military, declaring war on arguably the most powerful military in the world. And as this is happening, this charming fellow depicted here, Albert Gallatin, you don't need to remember his name, he's the Secretary of Treasury at the time, and he's being told by Madison and the Republicans, we need to fight the war, we need to find money, but guess what? We're not going to increase the size of our government. We don't want to create new debt, we don't want to create new taxes, but we need you to find us money to fight this war somehow. And he sees this as an impossible task. In fact, Congress isn't even sure they want to increase the size of the military to fight the war. In the end, Congress authorizes a slightly larger army, but still mostly want to rely on locally raised volunteer militias. Congress also decides the British Navy is so dominant that they don't really need to bother with the Navy and vote against increasing its size. And not only was the military unprepared, so was the government. Many congressmen had wanted to go home for spring break, essentially, right before the war was declared. The break was denied, but many of them left anyway, meaning there wasn't often a quorum, meaning enough people for votes to be binding at different times early in the war to even pass laws. Just as important as what was going on in the in the battles, which were a lot of early defeats for the US, was this financial situation. Often, the money situation was so bad that the US defaulted on its loans, meaning essentially it's declaring bankruptcy. For long periods of time, members of the military aren't paid. Somewhere around 12% of the US military deserts during the war, which is something that's unthinkable today because they're not getting paid. And they can't really borrow any money. And so as this is going on, the US is fighting a war where it's not going great on the battlefield. Things get so bad at one point that Great Britain burns down the White House in Washington, D.C., although the US also does have some victories. In fact, they burned down the British capital in Canada. But in the midst of all this, right, there's this war going on. It's an existential war, meaning if the US loses, it's unclear the US will continue to exist as a nation. The US decides to take a decent portion of its fighting force, of its army, and take them way away from the front, the battle with the British near sort of from what is today Washington, D.C., up towards what is today Canada, and instead take them in towards what is today Georgia and Alabama, to fight not the British, but to intervene in a civil war within the Creek Confederacy. The Creek are a powerful Native American confederacy, and they are having internal conflict. The US sends one of its commanders, a guy named Andrew Jackson, who we will see many more times in our course, and a significant force of US soldiers to intervene in this war. And I mention this to show you how important the US views Native American power as, and what a high priority it is to check and fight Native American power for the leadership of the United States. They're taking desperately needed soldiers away from a war with Great Britain to intervene in a civil war among the Creek Confederacy. In the end, Jackson is successful and he defeats the key Creek forces and seizes huge amounts of territory from the Creek Confederacy, area that's equivalent to basically most of Louisiana today if we were to in size. As I mentioned, the British do burn down the White House. And in fact, it looks like they're going to march on Baltimore and take it. US forces make a final stand in Baltimore, which is quite near Washington, D.C. And if any of you recollect the lyrics to the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, right? There's lyrics like, the bombs bursting in air, we saw the flag was still there, right? Those lyrics refer to the Battle of Fort McHenry, which is a fort in Baltimore, where U.S. forces stopped the British just after they burned the White House down. So the national anthem of the United States is actually about the War of 1812. At this point, the U.S. is bankrupt. They've barely held off Britain from taking Baltimore after burning D.C. down. Troops are deserting. Significant portions of the military are coming back from having fought in a Creek War. And significant numbers of people, especially Federalists who are friendly with Great Britain, are increasingly worried about the war and what's happening. So a bunch of Federalists gather together in Hartford, Connecticut at what they call the Hartford Convention. And at the Hartford Convention, these men start to consider some pretty radical things. Some go so far as to suggest New England secede, leave the United States. Others are starting to secretly supply British ships anchored off the coast. The governor of Massachusetts is trying to negotiate a separate peace treaty apart from the United States with Great Britain. They're considering some pretty serious things. And here you see a political cartoon from the time depicting the Hartford Convention, with the Federalists here shown as cowardly, waiting to leap into the arms of the British king and abandon their nation. Eventually, the Federalists decide against the more radical things like leaving the United States, withholding taxes, or so on. But they issue a report that has some demands for changes the US needs to make. They say the United States should have to have a 2/3 majority of states to go to war, basically saying there shouldn't be controversial wars anymore. They say there shouldn't be consecutive terms for presidents. They're frustrated because they've seen a whole string of presidents, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Only John Adams of those four has been from outside of Virginia. They think that enslavers have too much power, and they also call for a repeal of the 3/5 clause. Unfortunately for the Federalists, the war's over. By the time they issue their report, a peace treaty has been signed, but they don't know it yet because the peace treaty has been signed in Europe. And it takes weeks for the news to get back across the Atlantic Ocean. But by the time it does arrive, it's not too long after the Hartford Convention has issued its report, and the war has ended on terms that are pretty good for the United States. Basically, it's something called status quo antebellum. That's not a term you need to remember, but essentially it just means things are the same as before the war. In this peace treaty, there's no mention of the ostensible cause of the war, impressment. Basically, the two sides agree to stop fighting and keep the borders like they were before the war. So when historians look back at the War of 1812, beyond the horrific loss of life, the biggest outcome is actually the Creek War and the US pushing the Creek Confederacy out of a huge amount of territory, opening it up for cotton slavery. For those of you educated in Louisiana in high school, which may be many of you, most of you perhaps, you've probably heard of the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson, again, the same guy is involved in the Creek War, defends successfully New Orleans against a British assault in 1815 at the very end of the war. The War of 1812 goes from 1812 to 1815. But the thing is, Andrew Jackson thinks he's saved the United States, turned the tide of war in its favor. But much like the members of the Hartford Convention, what Jackson doesn't know is when he fights the war fights this battle, the war is already over. So even though it has no impact on the outcome of the war, it does help make Andrew Jackson a national hero and a prominent political figure and set him up to run for president. But that's not going to happen quite yet. Madison is replaced by a guy named James Monroe, also a Republican, also a Virginian, also an enslaver who actually lives quite close to Madison and Jefferson in Virginia. And he's seen as an uncontroversial president. We aren't going to talk about Monroe much. I will briefly mention, however, something that's going to come up more so in some of our later modules, which is the increasing conflict over slavery in the US and how that starts to influence politics. So basically what happens in the United States as the US tries to expand and create more states, every time the US expands west, pushes out Native American groups, and US settlers take the new territory, that land is what's called a territory. A territory basically means that it's controlled, at least on European and US maps, by the United States, but it hasn't been formed into a state. So it's governed directly by the federal government in Washington, D.C. And then once enough US settlers move into the area to hit certain benchmarks, the area can apply to become a state. And many regions want to become states because it gives them a lot more power. They start to get to be able to elect senators and representatives and so on, and have more say in politics. So we haven't talked about all of these that have happened, right? Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and so on. But I'm going to talk about this with one example of Missouri. So there's this Missouri territory carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, but a small portion of it here will eventually become the state of Missouri. And when a state gets enough people and applies to become a state, they have to do a couple things. One, they have to come up with their own laws and constitution at the state level. And second, that has to be approved by the US Congress. And often this has been uncontroversial. States choose their own laws, Congress votes, they become a state. But in the case of Missouri, this is no longer a simple process. By this point, the United States Senate, which, as you know, is 2 senators per state, is evenly split. There are 11 states where slavery is central to their economy, and 11 where slavery is not. And politics have started to group around the issue of slavery. The states where slavery is central are determined that slavery be allowed to expand to every new state. That is, every new state should allow slavery. States where slavery isn't central, many are becoming increasingly opposed to the institution of slavery. Some have moved towards abolishing it within their own borders, and increasingly do not want new territories that will become states to allow slavery. And the reason for this is currently in the Senate, there's an exact 50-50 balance between senators who tend to vote in favor of expanding slavery and senators who tend to vote against it, right? This is in 1820. And both sides know that if this new state wanting to become a state, new territory wanting to become a state, Missouri, bans slavery, that the areas that don't want slavery to, the politicians, the senators who don't want slavery to expand, will have the majority of the Senate. Likewise, they know that if Missouri allows slavery, they will elect pro-slavery expansion senators, and that group will have the majority in the Senate. So when Missouri decides on its constitution and decides that they want to allow slavery, the Senate decides that the senators who are opposed to expanding slavery refuse to admit it. And had Missouri banned slavery, the senators who were in favor of expanding slavery would have blocked it. So Missouri is kind of stuck. They're becoming a pawn in the larger struggle over the future of slavery in the United States. And after a lot of political maneuvering in 1820, 21, 22, Missouri becomes a state. Missouri allows slavery, but the agreement is Missouri will come into the Union as a slave state at the exact same time as Maine, which will come in as a free state, right? Which means the balance will continue to be 50-50. And seeing the potential for this to become an issue going forward, Congress decides they'll draw a line right here at 36 degrees 30 minutes of latitude. And they say any new states north of this line up here will be free to ban slavery. Any states south of this line will have to keep slavery. And they see this as something that'll work for the future. They'll bring states in pairs, one free and one slave, and it'll keep the balance. But this will explode less than 30 years later in 1850. And the reason I mention this here is it shows that even as early as 1820, 1821, US politics are starting to revolve around slavery. At this point, the debate is not whether to ban slavery throughout the nation, it's whether to expand slavery to new territories. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about before I get to Andrew Jackson, who we'll talk about briefly at the end, is the election to succeed James Monroe. Monroe serves his 2 terms, and there's going to be an election in 1824. And there will be 4 men contesting this election. Henry Clay in the bottom left, John Quincy Adams, it's spelt Quincy, as you'll see in your textbook, but pronounced Quincy. John Quincy Adams is here with the sideburn mutton chops. Here's Andrew Jackson, and here's a guy named William Crawford. We're mainly going to care about these three men here. Andrew Jackson, who we've seen already today. John Quincy Adams, who's the son of John Adams. And Henry Clay here. So in 1824, these four men contest the presidency. And this is how the votes break down, confusingly. Jackson takes the states in blue here, right? Most of the South and a little bit of the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest. John Quincy Adams essentially takes New England and most of New York. William Crawford takes a couple states, but important ones, Virginia and Georgia. And Henry Clay takes 3 states in the Midwest and Upper South, where he's from. If you look at this map and I asked you who won, you'd probably say Andrew Jackson, and that would be reasonable. But the actual answer is nobody got 50% of the votes in the Electoral College. And what that means, if nobody gets a majority, is the election is decided by the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress. And the 2 men who make it to that stage, realistically, everybody's involved, but the 2 people who are serious candidates are Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Crawford has had a stroke and is not a serious candidate, and Henry Clay will choose to throw his support behind one of the 2 candidates. And this is what happens. When the election goes to the House of Representatives, each state casts 1 vote, no matter how big it is. 3 states remain with Crawford, even though he's not really a serious candidate. 7 states go with Andrew Jackson. And 13 states, a majority, go with John Quincy Adams. This is a big shift, right? He's gained all of these areas that went to Henry Clay in the previous election, right? Whereas Jackson has lost ground. And Jackson is furious as the election drags into 1825 that he got the most votes in the actual election, but ends up losing in Congress. And he accuses, this is Jackson on the left, accuses this guy, Henry Clay, of making what he calls famously a corrupt bargain. And what he means by this is that he says Henry Clay has traded his supporters' votes to John Quincy Adams in exchange for being named Secretary of State, a powerful position. Nobody actually knows if this is true for sure. Clay's supporters do switch to Jackson, or switch to Adams. But Clay and Adams also have the most in common in terms of their policies and the platforms they ran on. But whether or not the accusation is true, much of the public believes it. And it becomes a rallying cry for Andrew Jackson, that he was cheated out of the White House. And for 4 years, Jackson plots his return and plots to defeat John Quincy Adams in the following election. We aren't going to talk much about John Quincy Adams' presidency. As you can tell by the 4 years that he's in power, well, he loses next time around. And he loses to Andrew Jackson, a president who's so influential that for years historians referred to the period of time when he's in power and even a little bit beyond as Jacksonian America. And you can see he wins in an absolute landslide. It's not even close. So what changed between 1824-25 and 1828? Well, 1, Adams isn't that popular of a president. But 2, Jackson starts to revolutionize US politics, right? You can see the change. Boom, boom. Both sides end up running really dirty campaigns. Here are the bloody deeds of General Jackson, right? Adams supporters accuse Jackson of killing many people. I mean, he has killed many people, but they do exaggerate it. They accuse him of polygamy, because technically, or bigamy, I guess, because technically he married his wife before she had been divorced, although they were unaware that she was still married. Jackson makes just as many accusations against Adams, claiming with no evidence that Adams was running a prostitution ring of American virgins out of Russia. And the accusations get really kind of wild. Eventually, Jackson will win the election, and the bad taste of the real dislike between the two men is such that Adams becomes the first president to refuse to attend the inauguration of his successor. But it's not just that there's dirty politics. The important thing is actually that Jackson creates new party politics. So Jackson creates a new party. Up to this point, we'd had Adams as a Federalist, and every other president had been a Republican. And the Federalist Party kind of withered away and died after the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention. Jackson, in 1824, had run as a Republican, but in 1828, he runs as a Democrat. He creates his own party. He calls it the Democratic Party. Technically, this is still the same party that exists today, although its politics have flip-flopped between conservative and progressive many times since then. And none of the policies are in common, but it is still the party that we still have today. But just as important as creating a new party, Andrew Jackson creates new ways of doing politics, or rather brings them into the mainstream of federal politics. He hires on a guy from New York State who's an expert at getting people out to vote through legal and not so legal means. He starts hosting like barbecues in places with free food to get voters out. There's all sorts of, basically they start building the first political party machines to mobilize voters. And Jackson's just really good at this. He also starts to make peace with all of his political enemies so that he's pretty much on good terms with everybody except John Quincy Adams. His campaign starts using like physical objects, especially starting to try and bring women who can't vote at this point into politics in the hopes they'll influence husbands and sons. So here's a jewelry box with a likeness of Andrew Jackson as a younger man on it. The Adams campaign does the same, although theirs are less successful. A tea set with John Adams, for example. John Quincy Adams. But perhaps most of all, Jackson is very good at connecting with white voters who are not incredibly wealthy. And to give you an example of how he does this, I'll tell you a brief story about a man named Sam Patch. Sam Patch, weirdly, is a man who becomes famous by jumping off of things. So when Sam Patch in 1827, just before this election of 1828, where Jackson comes to power, becomes a well-known figure when he leaps off a 70-foot cliff in New Jersey. He jumps 70 feet into the river below and he survives. But he doesn't just jump off as a daredevil. Sam Patch, who is 27, 28 years old at the time, starts to become a known figure. But he's not just jumping to jump. He's jumping as a form of basically political activism. It starts out kind of petty. Basically, Sam Patch works in a mill, like a factory, and he's really upset about what's happening in his town, like Paterson, New Jersey. There's a wealthy guy, you don't need to remember his name, but Timothy Crane, who has gotten his money from factories, and Patch sees basically has made his money off of workers like himself. And to show off his money, Crane has built a fancy new park. But to get into this park, you have to pay a small fee. And the fee is small enough that if you're wealthy, it's negligible. But if you're not, it's borderline prohibitive. And this would be done to keep out most citizens who were seen as undesirable. And Sam Patch and his fellow mill hands understand that they're the riffraff that Crane wants to keep out. And Crane's scheduling this grand opening for his park. And so Sam Patch decides to ruin it. And so he's trying to find a way to discourage anybody from attending the grand opening. And he decides, what better way to discourage people from attending it by having them come see something they want to see more. In his eyes, this is a man jump potentially to his death. He says people won't be able to resist it. He does survive, and then he starts going around. Anytime there's new factories or gardens or things that he thinks like the wealthy emerging industrialist class would like, he finds a place nearby to jump off and distract from them as a form of protest. For a couple years, Sam Patch will jump from the top of waterfalls, cliffs, and other things as protests. And while some people thought Sam Patch was a fool, he's popular enough he becomes one of the first sort of celebrities in the United States. And Andrew Jackson, I told you we'd come back to Andrew Jackson, starts to see that he can connect with many of the workers and middle-class people who are in favor of Sam Patch. And so to signal his support for Sam Patch in an era where there's no TV or radio, he does what's most visible. Jackson is frequently pictured, even when he's president, in military garb aboard astride a horse. And so he names his distinctive white horse Sam Patch. And his horse becomes so well known due to this name, and Jackson always being pictured in it on the horse, that when the horse dies, it's given a full military funeral and a 21-gun salute. And Jackson's very shrewd. He does this to show his alliance with kind of what we might today think of as white working class voters. And Jackson has a different history than many presidents. He grew up relatively poor, although he fairly quickly as an adult gained wealth. He was initially a lawyer, but he gains most of his wealth as a slave trader and an enslaver who owns a plantation called the Hermitage near what is today Nashville in Tennessee. And he's the first president from what would have been called at the time the West, basically not the Atlantic coast. And he's the first president who people would have considered in perhaps today's term to be new money rather than old money. And he wanted to be, and was in many ways, a revolutionary president. Much of his revolution was damaging and vicious, but it was effective for his means. Jackson wanted a stronger executive branch. He wanted personal power in the White House. And one of the ways he does this is by wielding the presidential veto in a way that's common today, but was unprecedented at the time. All of the presidents leading up to Andrew Jackson combined had vetoed 6 things, including one president who'd vetoed their own bill. And they used the veto only when they thought something was unconstitutional. Andrew Jackson changes this and uses the presidential veto as a political weapon to veto things he doesn't like, whether or not they're constitutional. And this is just one example of many ways that Jackson consolidated power in the president to try and pull it away from Congress and the court system. And his opponents derisively referred to him as King Andrew. Here's a political cartoon referring to him as King Andrew I. You can see him standing over a shredded copy of the US Constitution and holding his weapon of choice, the veto. It says, "Born to command," showing Jackson as someone who is more interested in power than obeying the law. And we will see Jackson break the law repeatedly. So we're going to pause there That was a very whirlwind tour of sort of political and military and economic events for the first 30 plus years, 40 years of US history. The case study for this week will kind of help supplement that. It'll involve Jackson as well, and it'll involve basically the lead up to the Trail of Tears, and involving Cherokee Nation and Andrew Jackson. And that will lead also into your assignment for this fourth module.